So I found 3 different Reddit posts of people claiming that their dad was actually Mr. Cruel, so I wanted to go through them. Now this video isn't going to go into detail of what Mr. Cruel did. There's a lot of videos you can find on him, but basically Mr. Cruel would kidnap kids and SA them, and he was also a suspected murderer active from 1987 to 1991. It was confirmed that he kidnapped 3 girls, and there was a 4th kidnapping and murder which was suspected to be him. In the first 3 kidnappings, he would break into a family home wearing a balaclava, he would tie up the family, SA the girl and kidnap her, and then a few days later he would drop off the girl at a random location. If he's still alive, he's definitely at least in his 60s or 70s, but considering the crimes abruptly stopped one day, it's fairly likely that he's either dead or in jail for a different crime. Anyways, let's get into the posts. Scared and confused. Was I raised by Mr. Cruel? Hi fellow Redditors. Not too sure if this is even where I should be or even if I should be posting this. It's been on my mind for many decades now. At least 30 plus years, and it's always terrified me. Although I have no definitive evidence, the coincidences are just too much. To start with, I'm only mentioning all of this because I know it's anonymous, and if it wasn't, then there's no way I would even consider mentioning any of this in a public forum. I grew up in an extremely abusive household. My mother displays narcissistic personality disorder, my stepfather is a pedophile, and his oldest son is an alcoholic, a compulsive liar, and also a pedophile. Sadly, I know this from first-hand experience, and also know that I'm not the only person that was afflicted by their attentions. My mother did nothing about the situation. In fact, she often deliberately put me in a compromising position, leaving me in their custody or turning a blind eye when she had undeniable evidence that something occurred. Although this group is about unsolved murders and not other forms of abuse, this will all make sense as it's all intertwined. When I was about 11 years old, I lived in the state of Tasmania in Australia. My eldest stepbrother had moved interstate to Victoria to join the army, and I was relieved for the break from his presence. When he completed his basic training, my stepfather and my mother went for a trip to Victoria to watch my stepbrother march out, which is a ceremony at the end of their training to signify that they were now full-serving members of the Defence Force. They were gone interstate for approximately a 2-week period. My dates are not 100% accurate, but they were gone from about late August to somewhere mid-September. I remember this clearly because once they came back to Tasmania, they had nothing but praise about mainland Australia, and they wanted to move there. We were packed and ready to move very fast, and were gone in just over 2 weeks after their return. We arrived in Melbourne on the 5th of October 1987. Not long after we moved to Melbourne, there was an awful case on the news about a man who was abducting young girls from their homes and abusing them. One of his last victims that I was aware of was a young girl named Carmen Chan. Although I was so young at the time and often ignored whatever stories were on the news at night time, this stuck with me because we often ate dinner with the television on at the same time. Whenever something came on the news about Carmen Chan and the abductor that the media had dubbed Mr. Cruel, my stepfather would snap at me and insist that I should shut up and keep quiet while he listened. He would turn the television up louder and became very focused on whatever the news was reporting. Mr. Cruel had abducted a few girls leading up to this point and had mostly just assaulted them before he left them somewhere where they would be discovered and returned to their family. In Carmen Chan's case, however, she was never returned and eventually she was found deceased. My stepfather's abnormally intense interest in the news surrounding these cases always confused me, as he most certainly did not concern himself with my welfare, and there was plenty of violent news on television for him to absorb, so I had no idea why he was so interested in Mr. Cruel. He did have some other peculiar interests, as he used to own a collection of booklets printed about serial killers in our home library. I didn't read them all as I was too young and I really had no interest in the subject at the time, but I remember a book about Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. Of course, this is not illegal to possess and on its own not entirely suspicious. But if you combine it with the rest of my post, then perhaps it'll seem a little more dubious. Anyway, it wasn't until I was much older that I started to question as to why my stepfather seemed so interested in Mr. Cruel at the time. That's when I started to read up on what little information the police had on the criminal/murderer. They believed that he was in the Defence Force. I think because of the way he was so clean and left behind no evidence, or minimal evidence at most. At the time of these abductions and murderers, my stepbrother was in the army, but my stepfather was also a manic neat freak. He would make me wash the hubcaps of the car with a toothbrush when I was cleaning the car, and one day he even went on a meltdown because I left a tiny ink mark on the front page of a newspaper while I was checking to see if a pen was working. His tidiness was a compulsion. The one piece of physical evidence that apparently Mr. Cruel left behind was a whisker, so the police thought that they were looking for a redhead because the whisker was red. Now both my stepfather and my stepbrother are brunette. Unless they grow facial hair, they both have red facial hair. The police also thought that their suspect was from either Tasmania or New Zealand, due to some colloquialism language that the abducted girls heard. I can't recall the exact phrase that was released to the media. I just know that when I read it at the time, I recognized it as something my stepfather and stepbrother used. They often use colloquialisms such as, "How do you like them apples?" or "How does that grab ya?" in a sadistic, condescending tone. This is just a couple of the many they used. Also, at the time of the abductions and abuse and murder, all of the victims were female, and all of them were the same age as myself. Lastly, the last coincidence that comes to mind at the moment is the timeline. From what I read in the media, they believe that the first abductions from Mr. Cruel occurred sometime in either late August to mid-September 1987. According to the Wikipedia, the first crime was 22nd August 1987, so it does line up with what she said. I can't recall the exact date, I just remember how ill it made me feel to know that both my stepfather and my stepbrother were both in Victoria at the time this happened. And the last victim they believe Mr. Cruel abducted was either in September or very early in October in 1992. It says here that the last kidnapping, Carmen Chan, was abducted on the 13th of April 1991. Her body was discovered on the 9th of April 1992. So it's about 5 months earlier than what she said, but considering she's recalling this from memory from 40 years ago, I don't think 5 months difference is that important. These dates are important because against my wishes and against my stepfather's wishes, my mother insisted we move back to Tasmania, and we left Victoria on October the 5th, 1992. Just after Mr. Cruel's last apparent abduction before he went quiet in Victoria. Around the same time that we moved back to Tasmania, my stepbrother moved from Victoria to Queensland, so now both my stepfather and stepbrother were no longer in Victoria, although both of them had been there during the times that Mr. Cruel was active. Both my stepfather and my stepbrother have a sadistic streak, and I honestly believe that after living with them for 13 years, that either one of them was quite capable of doing these acts. My stepbrother was, however, a little skittish and anxious when he was being abusive, but my stepfather always kept his composure. At the time that Mr. Cruel was active, we lived in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, which is where Carmen Chan's body was found, and so did my stepbrother. Her body was found only a couple of suburbs away from where we resided. My stepfather does not appear to fit the physical description of Mr. Cruel, as he's quite short, but my stepbrother does fit it. It would not even surprise me if they acted, if it was them, as a pair, because each of them knew of the other's fetish/sadistic behaviors, and each of them covered for each other. At the time that Mr. Cruel was active, I would also like to note that at least one of his victims stated that they could hear airplanes overhead when they were abducted. We live in the northern suburbs of Melbourne at the time, not too far from an international airport, and underneath the flight path of many of the flights. Also, one of the descriptions of a room that one of the girls was kept in matches up with what I can remember from one of my stepbrother's rooms when he was living out of our home for a while. My stepbrother never lived on barracks when we moved to Melbourne. He either rented his own place or he moved back in with us for a while. I also recall his really odd behavior, which may not have anything to do with this case, but it was not uncommon to find him vacuuming his house or hanging washing out the back to dry at 1 AM. This may have something to do with him being a chef and working hours that were different than most, just getting household chores done when he could. But he was also an extreme neat freak, and I hated spending time there to keep his wife company, because as a 16-year-old, I did not appreciate being woken up to help vacuum or hang washing up so late at night. I truly believe that one of them, if not both of them, were involved in this whole Mr. Cruel incident. It terrifies me to think that perhaps their dislike for me, or their passion to be sadistic towards myself, is possibly why they chose targets that were brunette and of the same age as myself. There's a saying in Australia, which is, "You don't shit where you eat," which means if you're gonna commit a crime, you don't do it in your backyard because it's just too close to your home. So the thought of them lashing out at these young ladies instead of myself is just sickening. Of course, I have no definite proof on me, or they would most certainly be in prison as I type this. Obviously, I have nothing to do with them at all anymore. Whenever I was abused, it was either psychological and sadistic, which is just impossible to prove to authorities unless there is a non-biased witness, or the abuse never left any marks on my body, which again is pretty difficult to prove. My mother once told me when I was 14 that if I ever went to the police, she would lie and then ask me who I thought a judge would believe, her or a teenage girl. I was terrified to go to the authorities because I thought no one would believe me and then the aftermath would be much worse for me. Since then, however, I have had my stepbrother charged and he did end up spending some time in jail for some of the crimes committed against me, although most of them have gone unpunished. I don't hold any malice about that, and I'm impressed that the Victorian police were able to put together a case on what information they had, and they were able to charge him at all. I guess all these coincidences don't really amount to a criminal case, but it has left me feeling ill, terrified, and with no one to talk to about this. I can't shake the horrible feeling that I feel like I was raised by a serial abuser. Well, that one I know is a certainty. And a murderer who had no problem in taking the life of a young girl. I know that either of them are capable of such actions, although if I was asked to choose which one I thought it would most likely be, the physical attributes match my stepbrother, but the calmness of Mr. Cruel is something that was more often displayed by my stepfather. So I don't really know, but I'm very sure that one of them, if not both of them, were involved in this case. I just don't know who to approach who would take all of this seriously. As I type this, I'm sitting here shaking as I recall my old home and what those poor girls had to endure, and poor Carmen, who probably did nothing wrong other than to view his face. My heart goes out to her family, but I'm so scared that her family would bear a grudge towards me. Even though I had nothing to do with the whole situation, and I was the same age as Carmen, grief can make someone view perspectives differently. I would be ashamed to face them, unless I was able to assist them getting some kind of justice. Thanks for reading. Perhaps someone will respond with some kind of information or advice. Now, it's entirely possible they just made up this post for views or whatever, but considering all the very small details, this post seems believable to me. And there's also the fact that all the dates line up perfectly. Like the kidnapping started in 1987, that's when they moved from New Zealand to Victoria. And when they moved back is also when the crime stopped. But it's also possible that her dad was just similar to Mr. Cruel. You know, there's a lot of bad people in the world, and an abusive dad isn't exactly a rare thing. You know, they could have just been similar. But let me know what you think, and let's have a look at the second post. I have some suspicion that my dad is Mr. Cruel. I'm not sure how crazy this will sound, but let's try and get some opinions. I was born in 1985. My memories are very vague and distant. I don't exactly remember this story on the news, but as soon as I saw the photo, I knew I had been face to face with it. Anyway, let's get to my reasons. Here's my top 10. The locations of the assaults were all places near where my dad worked. Occasionally, my dad would borrow from family members a video camera, and I never saw him use it. He drove the same make and model as described in the articles I read. There is violent and SA offenders in my family history on my dad's side. I have a blank memory from my childhood where I got out of bed to find someone and I saw something that caused me to run and my dad chased me. By the time my mother saw this, I couldn't remember what I had seen. This led to my parents' divorce approximately 6 months later, which corresponds perfectly with Mr. Cruel's final kill. The police released many sketches over the years with different hairstyles based on witnesses. One in particular is virtually a photo. My dad is weirdly obsessed with food. He always has been. He would always make sure he ate and everyone around him ate. He would virtually force feed. So Mr. Cruel always feeding victims and himself makes sense. The way it's reported, Mr. Cruel acts, personality-wise, all describes my dad. While he never touched me sexually, he would glare, stare, and check out me and all my friends. He would insist on reaching over them to put their seatbelts on. My dad is deceptively intelligent. He's very good at science. He would be the sort of person to know exactly how to not leave a trace. So am I nuts for thinking this could be a possibility? Update 1. So I've educated myself about the case and contacted the police. The 2 names I provided were on a list. is being investigated. Update 2. Yes, I have been to the police and my suspicions are in line with the suspect they have in their list. This is being looked into, however, due to not wanting to mess with the investigation, I will not update again until he's either cleared or charged. And this was 6 months ago, so it's still recent. She also replied to one of the comments where she said one of the sketches of the victims is an exact replica of their parents' bedroom. Again, this could just be a coincidence and their father might just be a bad person that has similar tendencies to Mr. Cruel, but let's see what happens. Maybe they'll update, maybe they won't. In this next post, I'm not exactly sold on the validity of it, but I wanted to include it anyway. My father-in-law thinks he might have been in Mr. Cruel's house. I'm new to this case. I grew up in Western Australia and moved to Victoria in my 20s and married a Victorian man. Myself and my husband are in our 40s. My father-in-law, mid-70s. I had heard of Mr. Cruel and I remembered years ago my husband had said his dad thought he'd been in Mr. Cruel's house. After watching the UI episode, I asked my husband about this. He said that his dad, who worked for telecom for over 40 years, thought he had been inside the home of Mr. Cruel. But my husband doesn't know why he believed this, what suburb, or whether my father-in-law reported it to the police. My father-in-law now has the early stages of dementia, but I'll ask him about this. My father-in-law is a sensible, unassuming man who visited many houses through his work, so I'm puzzled why he would say this. And this was the update that she posted. He's very self-conscious about his memory because of the dementia diagnosis and won't be drawn into speculation. Unfortunately, I don't think I have much. He was adamant Mr. Cruel lived in Rosanna. So the suburb of Rosanna to where Mr. Cruel's crimes took place is honestly like a 10 to 15 minute drive. He doesn't remember anything about the visit or why it spooked him so much. He was so rattled by it that he confided in a friend who was a police officer, and he did go to the police about it. His cop mate confirmed some years later that it was Mr. Cruel. That police knew he did it but could not get enough evidence to charge him. He's certain Mr. Cruel was obsessed with fitness, in particular running. He stressed he's not certain about this but thinks his first name started with the initial M. I don't know if his cop mate is alive or not, and if he was alive whether he would tell me anything. He only told my father-in-law because they were good friends and because some years later he told him the detectives on the case knew who Mr. Cruel was and he did the right thing by reporting it. They just didn't have enough evidence. I think he told my father-in-law because he could see it still troubled him. All she knew was that he was extremely disturbed by whatever he saw at that house in Rosanna where he was installing or fixing a telephone. So this post is very he said, she said. The source is her husband's father who has dementia, which is not very reliable. But it's still interesting if he did run into Mr. Cruel back in the day. It's a hard thing about very old cases because Mr. Cruel's first attack was 47 years ago, so everyone that was around that time is like gonna be in their 60s, so it's so hard to find evidence at this point. Finally, I found 2 different posts of someone who found a very similar bathroom to one of the witness sketches. So in this first one in Coburg North, you can see that the shower, the bathroom and the sink are all in the exact same spot. The only difference is that underneath the sink there's like a cupboard, whereas in the sketch there's no cupboard. Even the bath tap is in the same spot. And here is the second picture. It's a bit different, it's a lot skinnier, but this one in Brunswick West doesn't have the cupboard underneath the sink, so it does look even more accurate to the sketch. But keep in mind, this sketch is 40 years old and this bathroom could have been remodeled since. You never know, it could have been the house, it could be a coincidence. But yeah, that's all of the things that I found about Mr. Cruel. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this was interesting and yeah, I'll see you next video. See ya.